Greetings, one and all. I am delighted for this opportunity to dialogue on a most interesting and I hope fruitful subject. Thank you, Daniel, for agreeing to do this. All right, so Jason told us in the introduction about the modal ontological argument for God's existence. Now, that argument is a further development upon the traditional ontological argument, which was popularized by Anselm of Canterbury. Closely connected to these ontological arguments is something which Anselm and myself adhere to, namely perfect being theology. The basic idea of perfect being theology is, not surprisingly, that God is a perfect being, the most perfect being conceivable, in fact. And what that means is that God possesses all perfections and lacks all imperfections. The perfect being theologian, then, will reflect upon perfections and imperfections to build up, without necessarily appealing to the Bible, what God must be like if he exists. So we reflect on what God must be like using our reason and go from there. Now, the appeal is not made to the Bible, but to reason. And reason is, by very definition, reasonable. All human reasoning is valid and sound, hence it is coherent. That's assuming, of course, that no mistakes are made on the part of the human reasoner. Daniel thinks we Anselmians have made mistakes in our reasoning about God. I disagree, and that's what we're here to talk about today. At the end of this reasoning process, we come to discover what God is like, and that definition of God Jason described in the introduction to this debate. God is omnipotent, omniscient, etc. My plan in my opening speech here is to focus on the two biggies of divine perfections. If those are coherent, then we may presume, in the interest of time, we don't have time to go through every one point by point, we'll assume until Daniel says otherwise that the more minor divine perfections are coherent as well. Anything that Daniel has already brought up that I will pass over in my opening speech, those I hope to come back to in the rebuttal speeches. The opening speech in a debate is not intended for rebuttals. That's what rebuttals are intended for. Now, before turning to omnipotence and omniscience, the two biggies, I need to make clear what counts as a perfection. A perfection is three things. It is A, an attribute which it is better for a being to possess than to lack. In my estimation, it is better to lack smelliness than to have it. The smelliest possible gym sock possesses the attribute of extreme smelliness, but that does not count as a perfection because it is not better to have smelliness than it is to lack it. A perfection must also be admit of degrees. So A, it is better to have than to lack. B, it admits of degrees. Power is an attribute which does admit of degrees. Some beings have more power than others. Some entities lack power. Some entities are less powerful than other entities. So there are greater and lesser degrees of power. Finally, to count as a perfection of God, a divine attribute C must have a cap. What I mean by a cap can best be explained by way of an illustration. Think of a mountain. We may imagine mountains of any height. A mountain could be 20 yards, 20 miles, or 20 light years high. No matter how high the mountain is that you are imagining right now, you could always imagine an even higher mountain. There is no cap to mountain heights, in other words. By this analogy, God's power does admit of a cap. Omnipotence is all power, or unlimited power, or limitless power. While it really is limitless, it makes sense to speak of total limitless power. God cannot make a rock so heavy that even he can't lift it, because then we would be ascribing more power than all power to the rock, and that would be incoherent. It would be incoherent because omnipotence is the cap on the attribute of power. Now I'll examine omnipotence more particularly. God is omnipotent if and only if he can do any and all actions, provided A, the action let me start over here. God is omnipotent if and only if he can do any and all actions, provided that A, the action is not self-contradictory, and B, the action does not conflict with God's nature. God cannot lie, for that contradicts his holy nature. Though a contradiction, a divine lie, would not be internally self-contradictory. I think this distinction between internal self-contradiction and external contradictions that aren't self-contradictory may prove helpful later on in the debate, depending on how Daniel rebuts my opening speech. We shall see. The fact that God cannot create nonsensical rocks or tell lies is not an imperfection or a limitation on his power, for it is better to be good and to make sense than to be evil or to be incoherent. Lying is an imperfection, not a perfection. It's imperfect to lie, not perfect. This definition of omnipotence is the key to its coherence. The first part of the definition says that God cannot do the self-contradictory. In other words, God cannot perform actions which are internally incoherent. Well, it makes sense to make sense. Avoiding incoherence is not being incoherent. The first part of the definition of omnipotence thus passes the coherency test with flying colors. What of the second part? The second part of the definition of omnipotence says that not only can God not do self-contradictory actions, he also can't do any other contradictory actions. Again, this making sense makes sense. If omnipotence cannot, by definition, perform incoherencies, then it is not incoherent. Non-incoherence is coherence. Moving along, God is omniscient if and only if he knows the truth value of all propositions. God knows that it is true that 2 plus 2 equals 4, and he knows that it is false that 2 plus 2 equals 5. But omniscience conceived in this way is very close to being identical to the traditional laws of all rational thinking, the laws of identity, non-contradiction, and excluded middle. Yet all valid and sound logic is built upon these three fundamental laws. Nothing could be clearer or less controversial than the fact that sound argumentation is sound argumentation. Logic itself is coherent, and so is omniscience, which is analogous to it. Omniscience is, in a word, coherent. Omnipotence in isolation and omniscience in isolation, omnipotence and omniscience, they're both coherent when they are taken in isolation, as we have just seen. What about if they work in tandem? There are only two possibilities here. First, God would coherently know that he can, or is, or has, performing a coherent action. Conversely, God could coherently work in such a way that he performs the act of coherently knowing some truth. So God knows he is acting coherently, he knows that in a coherent way, and vice versa. He's acting in a way coherent, he's acting in a coherent way to know in a coherent way, or he's knowing in a coherent way that he's acting in a coherent way. Phew! The divine perfections of God are therefore coherent, and so the definition of God makes sense. Hence, God is not impossible, he is possible. Thus, the modal ontological argument goes through. The upshot of all this is that God must exist. few again. Thank you again to Daniel. I look forward to hearing your response. And I will rebut in the rebuttal period. Thank you. Shalom out.